24 hours before the dawn that was supposed to end the Roman Empire. A young officer named Andronikos Palaiologos stood on the land walls and watched the Ottoman camp breathe like a living thing. The fires of 60,000 men turned the Thracian plain into a carpet of embers, and somewhere below the earth, enemy sappers dug toward the foundation of history. Andronikos was 4 feet from where the wall would have been breached. He did not know that tomorrow would not come as the astrologers predicted. The winds were already changing. Behind him, Constantinople held its breath. The great chain across the Golden Horn groaned under 2 months of blockade, and women of the Blasharni quarter boiled pitch in cauldrons dragged from abandoned kitchens. Andronikos touched the icon of the Theotokos sewn into his gambeson, a thing his mother pressed into his hands before the first Ottoman ships appeared. He was 19. He had never killed a man. He was about to become the hinge on which 2 continents would turn. The divergence came not from Greek fire, though the Byzantine fleet had loosed liquid napalm with terrible precision throughout May. It came from a single error in the mathematics of siege warfare. The Hungarian gunsmith Urban had assured Sultan Mehmed that the great bronze bombard basilica could fire 200 consecutive rounds before metal fatigue became catastrophic. He lied about the quality of his casting by exactly 12 rounds. At 11 in the morning on May 29, 1453, the cannon discharged its final 2-ton granite sphere toward the gate of St. Romanus. The ball struck the wall. The wall held. The barrel split open along a hairline fracture that had grown since dawn, and the explosion shredded the Janissary elite company waiting in the trench below. The earth trembled across 3/4 of a mile. In the sudden silence, the defenders heard the Sultan screaming from his command tent. Mehmed II had just turned to his vizier and uttered words erased from every Ottoman chronicle within a generation. The moment has passed. What followed was less a battle than a collision of 2 worlds refusing to break. Exhausted Byzantine defenders poured lime and boiling oil over the stockade thrown up behind the damaged wall. Genoese mercenaries under Giovanni Giustiniani Longo crossed the collapsed curtain wall and drove the straggling Ottoman infantry back into the ditch with pikes and secret mechanical crossbows. Fighting was hand-to-hand for 3 hours inside the moat, where bodies lay so thick that men fought standing on the backs of the dead. Andronikos killed his first man at noon. He used a short sword, no room to swing in the press below the gate. The Ottoman soldier was younger than him, perhaps 16, eyes wide with the same terror Andronikos felt. The boy died with a Greek prayer on his lips. Andronikos had no time to wonder why before the next wave came over the earthwork. The turning point arrived at dusk. Venetian merchant captains anchored in the Golden Horn saved their powder for a final salvo. They fired not at the Ottoman fleet but at the floating bridge the Sultan had built to bypass the chain. The bridge caught fire. The fire spread to supply barges carrying reserve ammunition for the remaining bombards. When the magazines exploded, the blast wave knocked Andronikos flat against the interior wall of the tower he defended. When he stood up, the Ottoman camp was burning, and the Janissaries were running. Mehmed II lifted the siege on the morning of June 3. The most honest accounts suggest he had already lost 7,000 men to the walls, 2 of his best pashas to crossbow volleys, and half his artillery trained to the Venetian powder. He rode east with the remnants of his army, leaving behind a city bled white but unbroken. The news reached Rome 9 days later. Pope Nicholas V reportedly wept. Then he sent a letter to the Basilius that would change the shape of the Renaissance at its root. Because Constantinople did not fall, the scholars did not flee. The libraries remained intact. The Greek classics that would have ignited the Italian Renaissance arrived in the West through copyists and ambassadors, trickling across trade routes in the hands of merchants rather than refugees. The result was not the death of the Renaissance, but its transformation. When Plato and Aristotle finally reached the West in quantity, they reached a Europe saturated with Latin scholasticism, absorbed more slowly, more critically, with less fever. The printing press, arriving in Constantinople in 1475, was understood as a tool for preservation, not revolution. The first book printed in Greek was the Liturgy of St. John Chrysostom, not the pagan philosophers, and the Eastern Church held the monopoly on the new technology for a generation. The political consequences were less delicate. Without the fall of Constantinople, the Russian principalities never claimed the mantle of the Third Rome. The Grand Prince of Moscow remained a regional ruler, not the heir of the Caesars, and Muscovy's expansion was checked by the absence of that divine mandate. The Orthodox world stayed centered on the Bosphorus. When the Ottoman Empire turned northward 15 years later, it found a Byzantium that had used the breathing space to build new fortifications and a fleet financed by Venetian loans. The Ottomans warred with the Persians instead, and the two great Islamic powers bled each other for decades in the mountains of Armenia, while the Christian world recovered. The long arc settled into a pattern unrecognizable to the men who fought on the walls in 1453. Constantinople never reclaimed its imperial reach. The Basileus ruled from the city and a thin strip of Thrace, a state that endured as a museum of Roman memory and a hinge between East and West. It never colonized the Americas, never launched crusades, never broke the papacy, but it survived. For a civilization that had seen 10 centuries of decline, survival was a victory more precious than conquest. Andronikos lived to be 67. He served as commander of the walls for 40 years, training 3 generations of defenders in the art of holding ground no one believed could be held. In his final winter, he walked the length of the Theodosian fortifications in the snow, tracing his fingers along the stones that saved his life when he was 19. Cannonballs were still embedded in the masonry, left by the Basileus as a monument to the day the end of the world did not come. He stopped at the gate of St. Romanus, where the bronze bombard had fired its final shot. The crack in the stone was still visible, a fault line in the architecture of expectation. He laid his hand against it and felt the cold seeping through from the other side, from the world that almost existed, from the timeline where he died in a ditch at noon and the city burned. He did not pray. He simply stood, a living hinge between two histories, and let the wind off the Sea of Marmara carry the sound of the muezzin from the mosque built in the Asian quarter, because even in this timeline, the city had always been a crossroads of old gods and new ones. If you have watched this far, you belong to the small republic of souls who know that the present is the thinnest of membranes. The past is not fixed. The future is not written. The only thing that holds the line between what was and what might have been is the willingness to stand in the breach and wait for the dawn. If you want to walk those other roads with me, subscribe. Share this story. Tell someone that the walls of history are not as solid as they seem. I will meet you here again, in another world where the bell rings differently. Until next time, keep the watch on the wall.